So the title of our talk is Not Fit to be a Doctor, a debate on medical professionalism and high-stakes educational decisions. And we're going to be talking about a situation that happened at another medical school where a student was dismissed just weeks before he was graduated, and then sued the school for breach of contract because he felt he had met all the graduation requirements. Just a curiosity, how many people here have heard of this case or are aware of the case? So not too many, so that's good. And the three of us don't have any disclosures. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to be trying an interactive audience poll at a couple times during this talk. And I'll explain to you how that's going to work when we get to those slides. So just make sure you have your remote device or your cell phone available. So our objectives are to discuss a case of high-stakes professional assessment and debate the merits of such assessments in medical education. So as I mentioned, this case involves another school, which I'll talk about in a minute. Their promotions committee dismissed a fourth-year medical student quite late, just a few weeks before the graduation date. The reason for the dismissal was for lack of professionalism, and then the student in turn sued the school because he felt like it was a breach of contract. He argued that he had met all the graduation requirements, paid all his fees, and in turn, the school, by not giving him a diploma, had violated the implicit terms of a contract. I think this is a good case to discuss as a medical center for a number of reasons. One is that professionalism is something that is not always easy to define, and it's less easy to educate about and assess. And having a discussion about a real case really grounds things. And what it reminds me a little bit of, it's not as dramatic, but is of the Terri Schiavo case a few years ago. If you recall Terri Schiavo's case, she was a young woman in Florida who had an anoxic brain injury and who was in a semi-vegetative state on artificial nutrition hydration in a nursing facility, and her husband sued to have her removed from the artificial nutrition hydration over her parents' objections. And the reason I bring this up is I remember when that happened, it was much easier to talk to my patients about goals of care and end-of-life discussions because they had a context and a grounding. And so some of my patients would say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that husband wants to pull the plug on this poor woman. And other patients would say, I would never want to be in her situation, make sure that I never get nutrition and hydration in this manner. So I think, again, this is not as dramatic or as visceral as that kind of case, but it does lend itself to creating a context to discussion, to create a discussion around topics that are not easy to discuss at all times. So how is this going to work? I'm going to present the key facts of the case, and I've also made a handout for you to refer to because there's a lot of data points along the way, and that's at the front table if you haven't grabbed one. And then we're going to have 2 points of view, so this is going to be a debate. The first point of view is going to be from David, and he's going to argue that the student should not be allowed to receive a degree, so that the school was right in having dismissed him. And then Marina is going to argue the opposite point, that the school had an obligation to grant the student a degree. And then we'll have some time for discussion.
That is totally shocking.
For those of you who are aware of this case, we've decided not to use the name of the student or the name of the school because even though this is a matter of public record, this is a public discourse that will be recorded, and just out of respect to the school and the student, please do not refer to the school or the student. So just to give you some background about the school, it's a highly ranked medical school. It's part of a larger private university system. It's a medium-sized school. There's 800 total medical students in all of its programs. It has 9 core competencies that dictate its curriculum, and professionalism is one of them, and actually it's the first one listed of the 9. The graduation requirements for the school is that the student has to complete all basic science and clinical components, pass USMLE 1, 2CK, and CS, complete a thesis, meet all their financial obligations, and be approved by the Committee on Students. And like our school, which we call the Promotions Committee here, there's a committee of faculty and students who vote on a roster of students to graduate. And so they must be approved by the Committee on Students. To delve just a little bit more into how they define professionalism, this is what's in their handbook. There's actually quite a bit on professionalism, but we highlighted this. The competencies include consistently demonstrating ethical, honest, responsible, and reliable behavior, identifying challenges to professionalism, and developing a strategy to maintain behaviors when adherence to standards are threatened by the clinical or research settings. The student is expected to engage in respectful dialogue with peers, faculty, and patients to enhance learning and resolve differences. And the student is expected to recognize personal limitations and biases and finds ways to overcome them. So that's how they define professionalism and their expectations for students by the time they graduate. So this is important when we consider this case. So let me give you an outline of what happened. So this student matriculated to this school in August of 2009. He was a young student. He graduated from high school at age 16. He went through college. He had outstanding metrics. Didn't take a gap year, so he was 20 years old when he started medical school. In January 2010, so that's his first year of medical school, an incident happened where he was late for 3 small groups, and per the school, he asked the instructor not to mark him late. The student later argued, yes, I asked him, but I had a compelling reason to. I was hosting somebody who was coming on an interview, and that made me late, and so it was, that's why I was late to small group. So no further events until January of 2012. This is when the student is a third-year student, and he was accused of being intoxicated at a school-sponsored party. He harassed 2 female classmates. He got in a heated argument with one of their boyfriends, and then he was accused of leaping out of a moving taxi to avoid paying a fare. He actually, apparently the taxi was going at 25 miles per hour, and when he fell out, he lost consciousness, was taken to the ER. Of note, no faculty witnessed any of these behaviors, and the student claims that he did not harass these students, and he claims that he is not sure how he ended up on the ground. He thinks he may have been mugged as his wallet was missing.
Who did that? Who accused him?
Students.
Other students?
Other students, yeah. So in June, he went before the promotions committee at that time, and the promotion committee reviews the incident, requires an intervention on professionalism, and so I'm not quite sure what that was, but he had no further disciplinary action, and it was not noted in his permanent records. But he was warned that any further incidents would lead to further review and potentially dismissal. So that's in January 2012. A few months later, the student's ending third year. He wants to apply for a research year, similar to the scholarly year that our students take. And the dean of students at that time writes a letter for the student for a research fellowship stating his work is entirely satisfactory and he's performing at a high level in his required courses.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is entirely satisfactory code for really be careful, or is that the standard wording? You know, like we're good is bad?
I think for a research letter, this would be totally fine. Yeah, I don't think it's code.
Okay.
I don't have the rest of the letter for context, but that didn't jump out at me. So he spends the academic year 2012-13 at another institution doing research, and he has a very successful year and has publications. February of that year, so he's still at the other school, this student is arrested while drives into a tree and is found to be intoxicated, and he's charged with that. He does not notify his school at the time. If you look at the school's handbook, it states that students must notify the school of convictions, but does not need to notify the school of arrests. So that's relevant to later on. So the student finishes his year, he comes back and starts his clinical rotations again in year 4. And again, he has a problem on his sub-internship, where he gets very concerning feedback from one professor, and he gets concerning feedback from a family that he interacts with. And it's also concerned that he pre-rounded on a patient and reported the findings when he had actually not done so. Another student accused him of that. And he got a grade of satisfactory with concerns, which is the lowest passing grade you can get. But because of the context here, he went back before the promotions committee. So this is his second appearance before the promotions committee.
Peter,
Yeah.
did his mother's school ever know about the February drunk driving incident?
They do not know. At this point, they do not know about that.
Did the place where he was doing the research know?
I don't know that.
That's key.
I don't know that. I don't think they did, but I don't recall reading it in the briefs. So the student said there's some context here. The patient's family had issues with almost anybody who was involved with their care. And he also feels, I'm not sure why, but he feels like the attending who gave him the bad rec had read his own rec of that attending, his own evaluation of that attending, and felt that this poor evaluation was retribution for his own poor evaluation of that attending. So I'm not sure what the context there was, but he said there was some reason for this. They review the situation and mandate that he repeat the rotation and receive gender-specific training. Again, I'm not exactly sure where that recommendation came from. And that he needed to repeat the clerkship, and that this would be noted on his MISB. He repeats the clerkship, again gets a satisfactory with concerns, and so there's a blurb in the MISB that he met before the promotions committee and needed to redo the clerkship, but nothing is really mentioned explicitly about professionalism. In the fall of 2013, his dean's letter or his MISP is completed, and the concluding sentence is, his interpersonal skills are strong and he works well with patients and members of the healthcare team. It is a great pleasure to present this student as an excellent candidate for residency training. And in 2014, the student matches at another medical center in dermatology. About 3 weeks later, the student is convicted of driving while impaired. He has some consequences from that, as you can see. He's notified by his lawyer 2 days later, and the student then promptly calls his new program director of the dermatology program about this incident. The dermatology program director immediately calls the dean of students at the student's school. So the student himself did not notify his dean of students. The program director did. The next day, the student actually gets a letter in hand that says he will be graduating with distinction in research, and it's signed by several of the people who are actually on the promotions committee. On April 17th, the promotions committee convenes. Again, this is his third time before promotions, and they dismiss him because of this incident, that he didn't notify them. The student maintains that he had all intentions of notifying the school, it's just the program director beat him to it. The student appeals the decision, and the committee, I think the appeals goes to the committee, back to the committee. The committee said, well, if you want to, you can withdraw, and that way you can apply to another school. But that's the best we can do. And then on May 14th, the student sues the school for breach of contract. And while this is being discussed and awaits the decision, the court restrains the school from dismissing the student until a subsequent hearing. So the student argued that it was a breach of contract because he met all the graduation requirements. He took the letter saying that he was graduating with distinction in his research as some sort of proof that the promotions committee had voted on him graduating, and he met all the other graduation requirements that I had spelled out. So this is the sort of the facts of the case. So questions of that before we move on to the next segment.
Was he able to start term residency in July?
I'll get to that. Yeah, David.
How is all this known?
This is filings of court cases and the briefs for the court cases. And everything here is from those. It's not based on anything else.
When someone is satisfactory with concerns, are those concerns disclosed anywhere?
That I don't know. I do know it's their lowest passing clerkship grade, and whether those things are included in the narrative of the grade, or I'm not quite sure, or whether that automatically triggers a promotions decision, I'm not sure. Yeah.
When he was sentenced, convicted of drug, when did that occur? I mean,
He was.
the incident must have occurred 6 months earlier or something.
He was arrested in February of 2013, and then he was convicted in April of 2014. All right, so this is where we're going to try our audience poll. So what you should do is if you're going to use a smartphone and texting, you should use the address 22333, and the message should be my name, no dots or anything, Peter Gliatto, not gelato as many people say, Gliatto 471.
472.
I'm sorry, 472, I'm sorry. And then if you want to, if you don't want to get charged for texting, you can go to this website and you can enter your response there. And please enter yes, no. Yes meaning the school breached its contract with the student and should not have dismissed the student. No if they were correct in dismissing the student. Or other if you can't decide.
So we have to do the first text to Peter Gliatto 472.
No, the first text is to, it's a little confusing. Text the address, you're texting this number, 22333, and then the message, Peter Gliatto at 472.
And then
Plus your vote, yeah. Yeah, then you text your vote. You text
it case sensitive?
Is it,
No, it's not.
Maggie, is it A, B, or C for this, for these choices? Yes, no, or other. Okay. Okay.
You can use the website as well, it's a little bit.
Yeah, Maggie finds the website easier, so if you can just go on there too. And you don't have to type anything in other than your answer.
Oh, did the student?
Did the school breach its contract with the student? Yes, no, or other for I don't know, or not sure. All right, so I'm going to go to the poll.
Okay, while we wait, I just want to clarify. Was he involved in 2 separate drunk driving incidents? Or
One drunk driving
or
incident.
he jumped out of the cab?
That was he wasn't driving.
Right.
And I don't know if he was drunk.
Right. That was one, and then one other separate incident.
He came to the promotions committee for 3 reasons. One was the party.
Right.
The second was the stuff that went on with the sub-I. And the third was because he got arrested. Yeah, John.
Okay. So what was the rationale for dismissing it? Was it because, like, globally a breach of professionalism, the arrest and conviction, or the failure to notify the school after the conviction?
I think it was all of the above. It was sort of like, this is a guy who's been before us several times. He's gotten feedback. He's not showing insight into his issues. And this last one was the biggest of them all. And this is somebody who's already had a context. So that was their feeling. Okay, so so far we have 6 saying yes, the school did breach its contract, 16 saying no, so the school agreeing with the school's dismissal, and 4 not committing yet. Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm going to turn this over to David.
Pete and David, thank you. And Rena, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be back here and see a lot of friends. If there's more room on the floor, I don't care if you sit on the floor. If people want to sit on the floor, it's fine by me. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys about professional behavior because I could talk about it for hours, but I'm going to try and keep it to 10 or 15 minutes because we're trying to leave enough room for conversation about this. I feel at a distinct disadvantage. I have a lot of degrees, but I don't have a law degree. I've never argued in court. I was never in debate team. So excuse my first attempt at making an argument in front of a jury, but dear to the jury. I'm going to do a few things. Number one, I'm going to talk about what it takes to be a doctor, to get a license to practice medicine in the U.S., in case you don't know. There's some couple of interesting aspects about that relative to this case. The second is what constitutes a reason to dismiss from a medical school. The third, I'm going to talk about which kinds of professional behaviors count or which ones should count, how do we measure them, and are they reliable, and then I'll get back to the case and apply those things to this particular case to convince those 6 people out of 16 who voted, but there are a lot more than that many people here, about why the school had every right to dismiss this student. First is just a point of fact about how you get a medical degree in the state of New York or most other states in the country, including Ohio. You really need 2 things. You need a medical degree from a LCME accredited medical school, and you need 1 year of internship. De facto, the real answer is you need a medical degree from a U.S. medical school that's LCME accredited, because anybody can get a 1 year internship doing transitional. I mean, there are so many places that don't fill, that need a body to fill a spot, that, as you know, there's a lot of people not from the U.S. or not from U.S. medical schools that get a spot. So essentially, the medical degree from a LCME accredited medical school is really the dominant characteristic that you need. And then on what basis do medical schools grant that degree? Well, why is it that they're given that power, and what authority do they have to do it? And I'll talk in a little bit about the ways they can do it, but I will now speak my only legalese for the entire 10 minutes. I'm only going to quote one case. It's a case that I'm fortunately very familiar with, because before I came here I was at University of Michigan. And I know many of the actors in the Ewing versus the Regents of Michigan case, which is the prevailing case that was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, in which the justices said in their ruling that university faculties must have the widest range of discretion in making judgments as to the academic performance of students and their entitlement to promotion or graduation. In essence, the way that plays out for all the medical schools in the country is that as long as you follow the process that you've put in place for graduating a medical student, as long as you follow that to the T, and that's a big deal, and as long as you have very clear process of hearings and appeals, then we're out, right? The Supreme Court said we don't have the ability to decide who becomes a doctor or not. You're the profession, you guys decide. As long as you do it fairly, as long as you do it transparently, it's all your job, okay? That's my only piece of legalese for the next 10 minutes. So what I said in that, though, was a few things that we have to talk about. Number one, it can't be arbitrary and capricious, right? It can't be some, you got to be able to fly a kite to get an MD degree. It can't be anything kind of crazy. There has to be a clearly defined process of hearings and appeals. In this case, and we won't go into it, there was a process of hearings and appeals. Marina's not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. It was followed to the letter. There was no argument that they didn't follow their process well. But I emphasize it again because it is the number one way in which medical schools get into problems with dismissing medical students or residents or fellows or faculty is not following the process. Enough said about it. The second is that they have to have a set of criteria to justify graduation or dismissal. And in this case, and Pete pointed it out already, this school has 9 competencies. One of them is professionalism. In fact, the number one is professionalism. The number one competency that they present is professionalism as an aspect of what they should do. So it's very clear that they've identified the principles upon which they could dismiss someone. The Committee of Faculty reviews medical student professionalism issues, and based on their handbook, and again, you saw that, it includes professional behavior, it includes convictions outside of the medical school. It's written in their handbook, if you get convicted for something outside of the medical school, it may be considered as part of a process to decide whether you graduate or not. It's not an absolute, it's just that you may be. So why do we then dismiss students from medical school? So clearly we dismiss people for failure of cognitive skills. And I want to make a couple of points about this. We don't fail students from medical school because they fail one test. And we certainly don't fail students from medical school because they fail one question on one test, right? Cognitive skills are measured, let's take a course like anatomy, right? How many times were your cognitive skills measured in anatomy to determine your competency in anatomy? Okay? Maybe there were 4 quizzes. Maybe there were 10 quizzes. Maybe there were 100 questions on each one, right? There are thousands of samples of your knowledge to determine your competency in anatomy. Thousands of samples to determine your competency in an area of medical knowledge. The same is true for communication skills, and I'll use our standardized patient program as an example here. It doesn't matter where you go in the country. It's not one interaction with one standardized patient or one patient that determines your competency in communication skills. Maybe you had a bad day, maybe you didn't know the content, maybe it freaked you out to be talking to doing a sexual history, whatever it is. We don't fail people based on a single event. It's multiple samples across a period of time, no matter whether it's knowledge or skills or professional behavior, and I'll get to that more in a second. So are professional behaviors really any different? And from that perspective, I'm going to argue no. Professionalism, measuring professionalism, I've said it before, is more like accounting than rocket science. It's not so fancy, it's just that you have to sample it multiple times over a series of different real-life events. You can't sit someone down at a table like this at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and give them a multiple-choice quiz and figure out if they're professional. You've got to sample them in the world of professionalism, not in the world of knowledge. Same with communication skills. You've got to measure people in communication. You can't ask them, how would you speak to this person? You actually have to watch them do it. So are there behaviors in medical school that justifiably, let's not talk about this particular case, are there behaviors in medical school that would justify dismissal for simply professional behavior? Great student, perfect scores on exams, great communication skills. Is there something you can think of? Is there anything you can think of that might justify dismissal based on professionalism alone? it's easy to think of, right? There's extreme examples of anything. I'll give you a real example, a medical student who had sex with an 18-year-old patient coming off the psych ward. Okay, there's nothing there, right? There's nothing there about cognitive skills. There's nothing there about communication. In fact, he might be a really good communicator, but a fast talker. Anyway, professionalism is really the only issue, right? Outside the medical school, you can go to the extreme as well. Is there something somebody could do outside the medical school? It could be the same sort of thing. It could be murder. It could be, right? Anything you could think of that would violate the Hippocratic Oath, you would argue, sure, that should be used. So let's dismiss with the idea that medical schools don't have any jurisdiction to talk about professional behavior as justification for graduation. In fact, it's just a matter of degree and where you set the level on what kinds of professional behavior, either outside of medical school or inside the medical school, make a difference. And whether in this case he met that threshold. So I'm not going to spend a minute talking about professionalism and what it is. People have written, I've written books about it, I've written chapters about it, there's articles about it. We're not going to talk about what exactly it is. We can use Justice Potter Stewart's definition of professionalism, like pornography. You know it when you see it. We can use detailed examples that were of definitions that were built for measurement. Behaviors, specific kinds of activities, it really doesn't matter. The question is whether some of these things can be measured. And I'll give you a couple of examples of things that we know can be measured, and they can be measured reliably, and they are valid because they link back to real behaviors seen in real practice. And the first one, and some of this data comes from work that I did back in the 90s and then subsequently has been validated by others. Probably the best example is an article in New England Journal from 2006 by Maxime Papadakis. I was a co-author. John Volosky at Jefferson was also an author. We took physicians who had been sanctioned for unprofessional behavior in practice. Sex with patients, fraud, felonies, aggression towards patients, hitting people, doing really horrible, horrible things. We took those people, and some of them graduated from those three schools, UCSF, Michigan, and Jefferson, and we happened to have records going back 30 years and got class and specialty matched peers and looked at them to see if we could tell any difference in a case control retrospective way. And it turns out that there are two things that stand out that are predictive of unprofessional behavior and loss of license many years later. By the way, that obviously a very high threshold. Not just that you did something bad, but that you got caught doing it, that somebody litigated you for it, and then that the medical board of that state took away your license because of it. And there were two things. One of them is a lack of conscientiousness. Identifying medical students who don't do the little things, who aren't attentive to details is number one. And the second is medical students who do not respond to feedback. They're given feedback, and then in the mid-clerkship evaluation, and then at the end of the clerkship, they come back in and they're still doing the same stupid thing that they were doing before. Okay? Those are the two big things. Now, we've validated that in a variety of ways. There's a study that I did back in Michigan looking at course evaluations. The students who don't do course evaluations are more likely to be seen as unprofessional later. The students who don't get their immunizations like they're supposed to are more likely to be unprofessional later. We've done it in surgery. You know, who attends, I mean, you guys are all here, who attends grand rounds, who attends all of these little detailed things. They're not everything about what professionalism is, but they're a little piece. And they're important because they're measurable and they're potentially predictive of future unprofessional behavior. So how do we measure this in medical schools? Well, I mean, most of you have seen this. We have evaluations from faculty. That's one of the ways that we do it, and that's something that was brought up in this case. But there are a lot of other ways to do it. You can do counting of who does their course evaluations or who gets their immunizations. But probably the most reliable, and this is out of a study out of Mayo, Darcy Reed did a study at Mayo comparing peers and nurses and faculty and other residents to find out who was probably the most sensitive detector of unprofessional behavior. It turns out to be peers. Now, that's probably not surprising. I'll give you just a second to think back to your medical school class and think of that one person in your medical school class who you thought was really unprofessional and probably should never be a doctor, and calculate the distance between where your closest family member is and where that person is, and just pray that they're not anywhere close, right? Because there's always somebody. Because medical schools don't have a good method for screening out unprofessional behavior at the moment of admission, right? We know that. We're working on it. It's not there yet. So we get people who behave unprofessionally to such a degree, sometimes they shouldn't be doctors. You've seen them, I've seen them. And the medical school's obligation then is to do something about it. Now, peers don't do that for us. I've done some work with Louise Arnold at University of Missouri, Kansas City, looking at what peers would do, what medical students would do to rat out their peers, and essentially nothing. They will not rat out their peers. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it for us. It's our job as faculty to do it. You know, we may know who's, I mean, I don't know if any of you ratted out your peer in your class. It doesn't happen. It's extremely rare because they feel like if it was really that bad, it's not our responsibility to do. You're the faculty, you're supposed to be doing it. So the threshold for detecting is lowest in peers, and it's pretty high in faculty. And again, the reason for that is it has to do not the fact that faculty are particularly unable to do this, it's just a sampling problem. Back to anatomy and 1,000 questions. If I spent a month with this guy, you know, if I spent probably 2 full days hanging out with this guy, you know, that would be, you know, 10 or 20 hours worth of time. That would be a nice sample. But attending spend an hour a day, maybe a little more with these people, and it's very hard to get a decent sample to be able to pick it up. So it's not surprising that we get very spotty results on professional behavior because the sampling isn't as good as it could. But when we see things like this, it's almost always the tip of the iceberg. So I argue that professionalism is no more or less reliable or valid than measuring knowledge and skills. We know that we've got some professional behaviors out there that predict future unprofessional behavior and loss of license. That's the definition of validity, right? Is it reliable? Yes. If you compare peers and residents and nurses, you get the same people who come out at the bottom of the pile or the top of the pile, either way, among all these people. So let me go back to the case and I'll finish up. Number one, the first thing that came up is he got a warning from the committee for improper sexual advances, being late to class, requesting a teacher to lie, and maybe skirting a cab fare. And I think there was a police report on that. His peers mentioned it to the faculty, but they eventually validated it through a police report. Red flags all over the place for me on that. Being late to class multiple times is the same thing that I think about in terms of attention to detail, conscientiousness, filling out course evaluations, paying attention to little details. It's one of those little things that raises a red flag, not enough to dismiss somebody, but enough to raise a red flag certainly on one time. Yep. 1 minute, you got it. So probably poor judgment, maybe hiding and deceit. The second one, he has a high-stakes clerkship failure for poor unprofessional behavior and patient communication lapses. It made him repeat the clerkship. I don't know why they made it. I do know why they made him undergo gender-specific training. He had problems with maybe molesting women before, and they realized they hadn't done that. I think that's why they did it the second time. And then they made this addendum to the MISB. The third one was the DUI case. And not in and of itself, I think, a cause for dismissing somebody from medical school, but as strike 3, I think it's a big strike demonstrating poor judgment on the fact that this case was not brought to court until a week after the match, right? That's not surprising. His lawyer worked down in North Carolina to get this case pushed a whole year so that he wouldn't be convicted in advance of the match and wouldn't have to tell his program so that he would match and therefore have to be able to go on like this. So in summary, there are about 150 or so medical students in this class at this school, and it's not unusual to dismiss maybe one student every year or 2 or 3 from any one medical school, this place included, for unprofessional behavior. That's a rate of about 0.2%. The national rate of professional license censure is 0.3%. So we're slightly under that in medical schools. We are not sanctioning enough, probably. Schools have a responsibility to students. Yes, they have a responsibility to this contract that they wrote to have the student go to their school, but they also have a responsibility to institutional standards. What does it mean to be a graduate of Icon Medical School? Do you want this kid to be your graduate? They have professional standards from the profession of medicine, and they have a responsibility ultimately to the public because this guy's going to get his license. I think we do a great job of keeping ignorant and incompetent students out of medical practice, but I think we do an inadequate job of keeping patients safe from unprofessional doctors. I think this guy should be kicked out. Thanks.
All right. I'll try to go through quickly so that there's time for discussion. So I will focus really on the legal aspects because I really don't disagree with David. Actually, when we work together, we rarely disagreed, right? But I don't disagree in the sense that professionalism, yes, I agree. You should be able to judge a student's professionalism and act on it, potentially dismiss a student. But that's not really the focus of this as far as I'm concerned. My focus is more on what's the role of the court in a case like this. So the governing legal principles are that the relationship between a student and the school that that student attends is contractual. It's governed by the school's student handbook, and that's why David is right, that it's really imperative that you follow the procedures in the handbook, because otherwise you could be found guilty of a breach of that contract. And you have to follow your policies for the same reason. And courts will generally defer to academic decisions of universities, and in particular of medical schools. And that's okay too. The real issue here is whether a decision on professionalism or a dismissal of a student based on professionalism, is that an academic decision or is that a disciplinary decision that any of us laypersons can judge? Meaning, what special knowledge does the faculty here have of professionalism that deserves, that earns that court's deference? And by the way, even where the decision is academic, courts will defer to the decision as long as it is not arbitrary, capricious, or in bad faith. And again, to reiterate David's point, the easiest way to seem like you're acting in bad faith is not to follow your procedures or your handbook. And we spent a lot of time here trying to make sure that we adhere to every little step that we have in our handbooks. So what's academic? What's not academic? I've been here many years. To me, if you're late to clinic, that seems to me academic. That's like being late to class. If you lack the appropriate fund of knowledge, that's academic. That's easy to me. Now, if you commit tax fraud at home while you're on spring break, is that academic? It's professionalism, but is it an academic issue? Not in my opinion. If you are guilty of a DUI, is that an academic issue? I don't think so. That's you know, 20-year-old kid on a leave of absence from his school, drives into a tree. That's not an academic issue. It's an issue, and maybe the school has to deal with it, but it's not, in my opinion, an academic issue that deserves the deference of a court, because any of us can judge similarly, by the way, these allegations of sexual harassment. And I think it's actually important what the allegations were here. One woman said that she felt someone touch her rear end, and when she turned around, the student was there. So she accused him of sexual harassment. And another woman said he had propositioned her at this hippo party, which, by the way, the school served liquor there. So the fact that he got drunk at the party, I don't think should be held against him when the school itself served the alcohol that caused all of this. But all of this illustrates that, and David kind of took my saying for me, or Powell's saying, I was going to say also, this is really like pornography. Professionalism becomes like, I know it when I see it. It's very moralistic, it's judgmental, and it's really kind of in the eye of the beholder. And because of that, courts should not defer to academic academic institutions' decisions that are based on non-academic professionalism issues. in this case, there were a number of problems. The DUI, I think, we can all agree, was really the trigger for all this, because as you can see along the way, and we didn't even mention all the commendations that this kid got along the way after the Hippo party incident with the alleged sexual harassment, after his internship issue, his dean kept writing him these great letters about what a great individual he is. And throughout the years, there are actually things written about his professionalism that were commending him for his professionalism. So clearly along the way, the school did not think that these incidents were so bad that they warranted either discipline or a ding in a recommendation letter, or maybe not even getting a recommendation letter or passing the information on to the residency program to which he applied. They were really supporting him along the way, and he had been really a superb student and seems well liked by his peers. Anytime there was an incident, like for example in the internship, there were other faculty and students who actually came to his support. And it seems that the school wasn't exactly sure how to adjudicate those incidents because they never took action on them other than some mild, go to some professionalism training. And eventually they did make an addendum to his MISB that mentioned the sub-internship issue and mentioned some concerns, but it never mentioned concerns about professionalism. So the whole issue of the DUI blowing up at the last minute really, I think, was a ruse to go back and review what had happened. The other thing that the school did here, after sending him the letter that he's graduating and all of that, they wrote him a letter saying that they're going to review his academic record. And that's what went to the promotions committee. They never really told him, by the way, we're going to look back at the allegations of sexual harassment. We're going to resurrect the issues from your internship. They really just said, we're looking at your academic record. And then they evaluated his entire history and really rejudged it in a way that they had not judged it previously. All of a sudden, they took a very negative view of all of this and decided at the end that the cumulative effect of all these events was dismissal. And really that is sort of intellectually dishonest in my mind, because what really triggered this was this DUI and this apparent anger that he had not told them about it, even though their own school handbook said you really have to only tell us about a conviction. And whatever his lawyer did to help him, if that's even the case, that's not his fault. I mean, he had a good lawyer. His lawyer possibly helped him delay his criminal conviction, his criminal case, until he got into residency program. He notified his residency program right away. A day after he learned of the conviction, he told his residency program. So clearly there was no intent to conceal this from his future employer. And I would assume, he says he intended to notify the school. There's really no, we'll never know. So the issues here were not academic, so the court should not defer. And even if the court were to decide, okay, we're just going to say professionalism is academic, then clearly this decision is arbitrary and capricious, because the school essentially reversed its position relative to what it had been during the student's years of matriculation. So because of that, again, the court should reverse the decision. Very little time. Finally, so I guess here it's really the double issue. It's the issue of the process not being transparent in terms of what the student was told, and in terms of the rationale of the school. It seems really more moralistic and judgmental, and kind of a retrospective rewriting of this student's academic and social history in the school. And I think for, as a lawyer to an academic medical center, there's the law, there's the professionalism aspect, sort of our gut about who would be a good doctor and who would not. And then there's just the smell test. And those of you who I sit with, we talk about this all the time. How's this going to look when it goes to a jury? How's this going to look when someone from the outside hears that this is what we did? And I think just looking at the facts here, the school failed the smell test because they really supported the student all along, telling him he was doing great, with little, a very small tick along the way, in which they addressed. And they kept supporting him and recommending him and moving him along. And then on something that is contrary to their handbook, they kicked him out of medical school at the 11th hour after he had already been informed that he's graduating. So I would argue that the school needs to give this kid his degree.
Thank you, Marina and David. And sorry, Marina, we should cut you short on time a little bit. Happy to turn it over to questions, and we'll talk a little bit about the court decisions. Yeah, Michelle.
I have a question regarding the Ms. P, and mainly for Marina. Is the Ms. P considered part of the contractual agreement that a school has with a student? In other words, I feel like that to me was one of the biggest pieces of why I'm waffling on the issue, right? Because they gave him a Ms. P that said he should graduate, that he's a great student, that had accolades, that had all kinds of positive references to his evaluation of his performance.
So I think the way to look at it is so the school is contractually, we're committed to give a MISB. It's part of our procedures.
Right.
We're supposed to be truthful in that MISB. We can amend it. We can make an addendum later on if we change, if something happens. But what we write in that MISB, we have to stand by it.
And they made an addendum to the MISB, right?
They
made an addendum to the MISB after he failed his clerkship, saying that he failed his clerkship and had to remediate. In addition to the glowing comments?
They did. He after his acting internship, when he got the satisfactory with concerns.
In September, and then it says fall 2013, so it wasn't clear whether or not.
Yeah. So it mentions it in his MISP, but it doesn't mention explicitly that this is a professionalism issue on his clerkships.
Right, but it also ends with it's a great pleasure to present as an
absolutely
excellent candidate.
Right. The conclusions of all that, including that, is
All
that.
of that is that they are presenting him as an excellent candidate for residency.
And they actually mention his professionalism positively in the MISB a number of times.
Yeah.
Dr. Just procedural, is the conviction that he placed a felony or a misdemeanor?
Misdemeanor.
It was a misdemeanor.
That's a very important and differentiating point, certainly for the medical board of state licensing.
Or even the house, the ability to be appointed to the house staff of any given hospital. Or our own, to make a distinction, I think, between a misdemeanor and a felony. It's unlikely we would allow somebody to be appointed to the house staff regardless of whether they graduated. If they were convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor, they would, depending on the specifics. It almost doesn't matter what the court says.
Unfortunately, this is too common an occurrence in every medical school. Medical schools don't want to dismiss patients, do not want to dismiss students. This should never have gotten this far. This should have been picked up in September 2013 and brought before a committee, promotions committee, and settled at that time. We've made the same mistake here. We don't pick it up, or we let them go too far, knowing what's been going on in the background. And if I was the lawyer for the hospital, for the medical school, trying to defend my school for dismissing this student, I would have asked the judge or a jury, if it's a jury trial, one question: would you want this individual to be your doctor? They're going to win every time.
So we were talking about this before. This is, I guess you'll talk about it in a minute. This did not go to a jury, and it would be a simple case, I think. And Marina, we're saying, in front of a jury, it's not a hard case to win. In front of a judge, it's a different deal.
And then there's also.
Well, I'd ask the judge, would you want this person to be your doctor?
So two more points, then I think we have to move on.
I mean, but how is the school expected to have picked up on it? He was under no obligation to notify them of an arrest. It's just an important point.
Yeah, right. Just a misdemeanor. Or a conviction is what the handbook said. Oh, Craig. Please stand.
I'll stand. Thank you. I guess, we all know people and sometimes students who are polarizing figures and who can generate very extreme responses where you know, some people give them glowing evaluations and some people give them otherwise. And could this student have been one of those kinds of people? And as such, it was a mistake to kind of push him along, right? And he sort of wound up on the more idealized side of the MISP until the DUI. So my question is, can the medical school admit we made a mistake? The MISP should not have looked as good as it did in the first place, and still not give him his degree.
I don't want to make a long discussion if we're out of time, but just quickly, I know, David, you work in faculty affairs and Scott in your role in GME. What if this was a resident who you knew this exact amount of information? What would happen if this happened to a resident? Would they get kicked out of their program? And David, what would happen to a faculty member?
The advantage that I would have is and Mike Lightman and everybody works in GME is we'd be sitting with Marina, and Marina wouldn't allow all of this to have happened. You know, one of the first things you learn is you don't argue with Marina, you don't argue with Karen Tiger.
Right.
You leave this stuff up to the experts, because this is what they do.
But if say it happened just like this, but it was a PGY2, would this person have gotten removed from their residency, do you think?
I would argue that the same as Marina, that it would not have passed the smell test. Marina would say to me, Scott, if we had handled this right, but we can't bring this forward because it's just going to get shot down. So we have to start from scratch, build more cases, do it. But I suspect
Probationary year. Probably get a probationary year out of this.
With the PGY2, it would be
Probationary
you'd be in an
year.
okay spot because you'd still have
You
time
have
to
another
do
year.
something.
Right.
If it was
Right,
at the
yeah.
last minute, it's because
Right.
with the DUI, you're almost it's like the fruit of the poison tree because you wouldn't have used the DUI otherwise,
Right.
but you're really using the DUI to go back and review everything.
That's right. That's right.
I actually have a question. So if they had used the failure to notify the school about the conviction as justification for dismissing versus a global assessment of his professional character, would it have been justified?
No, because the student handbook says you only have to notify of a conviction.
Well, that's what I mean.
And-
He was
and-
still a student.
Oh,
right?
oh,
He hadn't
oh, I see that he
graduated. So
didn't
that had been
notify
the
at the last
justification.
minute.
He was still prior to graduation. He was still covered.
I think the tough part about it, they'd have to go to trial because he argued, well, I was just about to tell you, and look, I already told my residency program, so of course I wasn't trying to hide it.
Yeah.
And it happened so quickly. You know, if 3 months had passed by, then you might have a stronger argument that he was really trying not to tell the school. But it happened so quickly that it would be a he said, and it would be, you wouldn't want to go to trial on something like that because it'll cost a whole lot of money, and you don't know how a judge or a jury would come out.
So just in the interest of time, just very quickly, final vote. This is, you type this in 22333.
We don't have to redo it if we did it before.
I think we should reset it, so you have to redo it. Yeah. And then type in Peter Gliatto, Gliatto 472, and then your response. So did the school breach its contract with the student? Several people have left the room.
What if you don't have a cell phone? Is that unprofessional?
You have no voice. I'm sorry, Dr. Case. So interesting. I mean, much fewer voters this time around. I'm not sure where everybody went. Oh.
Same deputy.
I want Marina on my team.
He's on your team.
Tell them what really happened last time.
All right, so we're that is a good debate.
We need your vote, Nate.
All right, I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it. So we'll just quickly back to the slides for the last 2 seconds. So the first it went to a single judge, and that judge ruled that the school did break the contract when it dismissed the student and issues a restraining order to the school saying you must issue that student a degree and allow him to proceed with his residency, which he did. The student more than meets academic requirements, wrote the judge. The school definition of professionalism is a moral judgment, not an academic one. and that has no specialized criteria by which a pool of physicians could judge. And the decision to deny, given what we've heard, is arbitrary and capricious. The school appeals. 3-judge is rule, unanimous decision, reverses it. So deferred, it said this is an academic decision. It's an academic judgment. We as in the law circuits cannot make this judgment. We defer to the school. There's numerous mentions of professionalism in the handbook, which the student did not adhere to, and they felt that it was neither arbitrary nor capricious for the committee to credit other accounts above the students, even when you delve into each one of those incidents, they were murky.
Although I will say the court did sort of express a little unhappiness with all the positive.
They did not like the MISP. They were mystified by the MISP, as they put it. So if you want to, these court cases are really interesting to read. They're publicly available. We can send them around as PDFs if people would like to. Just let us know. And I know we're out of time. I just want to thank David and Marina for all their work on this. And I want to thank Maggie, who really was super helpful with setting up the polling.
Thanks.